As several scholars pointed out during the last 3 decades, ancient Greek and Roman philosophy should be seen first and foremost as a way of life or as an art of living. The expression in Greek is techne to biou, in Latin ars vitae. If this is correct, ancient philosophy was basically about our self-transformation. We should see it then as some sort of spiritual exercise. Provided that these scholars are right, the ancient idea of self-management and self-transformation is based on arguments, on philosophical arguments, as well as on exercise. The arguments concern our attitudes to life, its brevity, contingency, and vulnerability, the goods we should follow and the evils we should avoid. The exercises practiced in this tradition are philosophical thought experiments, imaginations, and literary routines designed to lead to a change of our attitudes. Pierre Hadot, for instance, who is the most famous scholar in this field, distinguishes between 4 basic strategies of the philosophical art of living, which he locates in the various ancient schools and summarizes under the following headings: A, learning to live; B, learning to talk to others; C, learning to die; and D, learning to read. One could assign to these 4 areas spiritual exercises that were the foundations for personal transformation and that, if successful, should ensure a good life. The concrete content of these exercises, however, differed, as Hadot rightly pointed out, and also other scholars, from school to school, but could always be understood in terms of the respective definition of the good life. In this talk, I will provide a short overview over the motive of an art of living within the history of the Platonic school. It includes, and to some extent, what we believe the historical Socrates taught, then Hellenistic academic thought, and Platonism in the Roman imperial era, as well as in late antiquity, both pagan and Christian. First section, Art of Living in Plato, some fundamental topics. The actual emergence of the techne to biou paradigm was not a Hellenistic phenomenon, but must be understood in the context of the Platonic Socrates and of Plato himself, as for instance Vula Tsuna showed in an article. It is important to trace back the later philosophical developments to the original use of the concepts of bios and techne, as well as of logos and ascesis, as we find it in the Platonic Socrates. In Plato's early concept of philosophy, numerous indications for the conception of self-care and art of living can be discovered. They seem to go back partly to Socrates and partly to be of non-Socratic origin, even if this distinction can hardly be precisely maintained. Socratic in origin is probably the idea that philosophy consists in a rational examination of one's own and of others' conduct of life, as it is said in Apology 28e. An unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. That is explicitly in 38a. Philosophy thus represents a care for the soul. The expression is epimeleia tes psyches. Similarly, the expression psyches therapeia in the Laches, that is the attempt to form a harmonious personality. An example of this testing method can be found in Plato's dialogue Laches. There it is said that Socrates leads everyone with whom he speaks, I quote, incessantly around in conversation until the person concerned can no longer help but give an account of how he now lives and how he has spent his previous life. That's Lucky's 187e. Plato's idea that the philosopher is, as it were, only on his way to wisdom, that is, according to Plato, the meaning of the word philosophos, someone who is on the way to wisdom, and that whoever is really wise, on the other hand, no longer philosophizes, also seems to be connected with Socrates, namely with his proverbial ignorance. The philosopher appears additionally as an eroticist, that is said in the Lysis and in the Symposium, who knows nothing himself, but seeks education, practice, and enlightenment in order to gradually attain true knowledge. The philosopher's activity, moreover, is characterized as a midwifery for the benefit of others. He himself remains barren and confines himself to delivering the mental children of others and testing their fitness for life. This is a famous passage from the Theaetetus. Further, the figure of the historical Socrates seems to be related to Plato's ideal of proper self-knowledge, of appropriate self-assessment. The famous inscription, "Know thyself, gnothi seauton," on the temple of Apollo in Delphi, appears in Plato's work in a philosophical interpretation. In Plato's Phaedrus, it is said that it is meaningless to occupy oneself with anything else as long as one has not followed the Delphic call to self-knowledge. One must first know whether one is by nature a wild animal or a noble divine living being. Close to the Delphic motive, the motive of a self-referential knowledge is also treated in the Charmides, where knowledge of oneself, heautou episteme, in Charmides 165d, is associated with prudence, that is, with measured behavior. An explicit treatment of the motive of self-knowledge in the sense of a philosophical art of living is found especially in the allegory of the eyes in the Alcibiades 1. There, self-knowledge is identified with the Platonic care for oneself or care for one's own soul. That is in 129a. Maybe these points can count as genuinely Socratic, these points which I just mentioned. Numerous further aspects might be taken as evidence for a conception of the art of living in Plato without being of Socratic origin. First of all, the idea of practicing to die is relevant. According to Plato, the real philosophers strive all their lives, I quote, for nothing else than to die and to be dead. This is famously said in the Phaedo. Philosophy is hence characterized as an exercise in dying, melete thanatou. Philosophy thus acquires a redemptive function, which not only ensures happiness in this life, but should also lead to the best possible life after death. Then it provides the philosopher in this life with knowledge of virtue, thus bringing him at the same time into possession of virtue and guaranteeing his happiness, as it is argued both in the Dias and in the Republic. Furthermore, the motive of an assimilation to God, homoiosis theo, as far as possible, is important, which Plato emphasizes several times as the goal of philosophical endeavor. For instance, in Theaetetus 176a. Plato thus forms an emphatic the personality-changing effect of philosophy. the philosopher possesses true knowledge, episteme, as opposed to mere opinion, doxa, for the objects of his knowledge are said to be unchanging and always constant. The philosopher, in contrast, is contrasted with the sophist, who is characterized as a mere conjurer and trickster. In order for someone to become a philosopher, he must have made, according to the well-known allegory of the cave, a change or conversion, a periagoge or peristrophe, which means turning around, and then later became the Greek term for the Latin conversio, which means turning to the real life. Philosophy viewed in this way stands for an ascent, an epanhodos, of the soul. Admittedly, the philosopher appears to ordinary people as little fit for life because of his distance to the everyday world. That is said in the famous story of the young girl who ridiculed Thales. That philosophy represented a life-determining knowledge for Plato is thus correct independently of the question on which sources his concept of philosophy goes back and whether the mentioned indications can be put together to a consistent picture. So these are many elements. Maybe they do not fit together ideally, one can discuss that, but the Socratic and the non-Socratic elements are clearly present in Plato. Further evidence can be found in Plato's school, in the old academy, in the pseudo-Platonic definitions, for instance, which originate from Plato's circle of students. Philosophy is characterized A, as a striving for knowledge of the always being, B, as the contemplative attitude of the true, in which way it is true, and C, as the care for the soul combined with right deliberation. End of quote. All three determinations obviously place the person of the philosopher in relation to true knowledge and have clearly this element of an art of living. Two characteristics of the Platonic art of living should be explicitly pointed out here. First, in Plato's writing, the concept of an art of living is almost everywhere connected to a spiritual or religious atmosphere. We see everywhere a tendency towards otherworldliness, so there is this inherent element of spirituality. Second, nevertheless, the exercises requested for someone's self-transformation are almost completely intellectual ones. We find no clear indications of a non-cognitive sort of practice. So sometimes he speaks of prayer or he speaks of religious sacrifices, but the core of his strategy of transforming one's life is clearly argumentative and conceptual. Second section, pagan Platonism in the Roman imperial period and in late antiquity. Concerning the Hellenistic New Academy, I can be brief here. One should be more careful and more detailed, but I can be brief here. Its philosophical skepticism seems to follow the teknetou bio paradigm, insofar as a theoretical distance from dogmatism was seen as a way to happiness. As in the case of the Pyrrhonian skeptics, the crucial point is that abstinence from any firm belief is seen as a way of self-liberation. So don't believe in the dogmatic things defended by schools, and you will leave behind firm, fixed ideas, and then you will be happy and free if you don't believe in these things. In the case of the authors and schools of the early imperial period and late antiquity, the thesis that their philosophical self-understanding was that of the art of living does not seem quite plausible at first. There are two main reasons for this. On the one hand, there is no unbroken institutional continuity between Hellenism, the imperial period, and late antiquity. It therefore seems doubtful whether there could have been a continuity of teaching in terms of content. On the other hand, it is striking how much the schools of philosophy in the Roman Empire were interested in teaching orthodoxy, cultivating tradition, commenting on texts, and synthesizing different positions. They seem to have possessed primarily an educational interest in classical Hellenistic philosophy that was philosophically conservative and systematically harmonizing. So it seems not the case that they genuinely continued to do philosophy, but it did more in the sense of an important element of higher education. It is, however, remarkable to see that there is an ongoing line of Hellenistic traditions, for instance, concerning Epicureanism until the 3rd century AD. It's an article or several articles by Michael Erler on that topic, so you can find Epicureanism even in the 3D, which is remarkable. Also, the imperial Stoics Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Titus offer good examples for the unbroken appeal of the art of living model. But this does not apply only to them. The concept of an art of living and the guidance of the soul also proved to be decisive for late antique Neoplatonism, as can be seen, for example, in the biography of Plotinus, who is the founder of Neoplatonism in the 3rd century, written by Porphyry. In this text, Plotinus is portrayed as an intellectual, spiritual, and at the same time philanthropic teacher. He had never slackened attention to himself. In the aristocracy of Rome, Plotinus was given numerous young people to educate. He is said to have always been available to his extensive circle of friends. It is also relevant that Plotinus planned the foundation of an ideal community, which he called Platonopolis, in which he wanted to live with his students and friends according to the Platonic principles taken from the Republic. The Platonic spirit of otherworldliness is clearly present in a famous mystical passage taken from one of Plotinus's writings, namely Aeneid 4:8, number 6 in the chronological order. I quote the first 10 lines from the 1st chapter. He says, "Again and again when I wake up from the body into myself, leave the other behind me and enter into myself, I see a wonderfully tremendous beauty and trust in such a moment to actually belong to the higher realm. I realize highest life. I'm at one with the divine and founded on its foundation. For I have reached the higher actuality and have established my state high above all that is otherwise spiritual. After this standing still in the divine, when I descend there from the spirit into the deductive thinking, again and again, I must then ask myself, how is this present descent possible? And how did my soul once get into the body, the soul which, despite this stay in the body, still showed me its high being, since it was for itself." End of quotation. Plotinus raises the question here how the descent of his soul might be understood given the heavenly roots of all of us. Accordingly, he wonders how the soul can ascend back to the transcendent reality. Art of living thus means for Plotinus a strategy to self-simplification, according to his motto saying "Afhele Panta," which means leave behind all, so leave aside all you have, and a flight of the lone to the lone, phyge mono pros monon, which means leave behind the world and go to the more unified intellectual reality. The way in which Plotinus practices this form of an art of living becomes clearer from the following text, which is taken from Ennead 6, number 9 in the chronological order, and chapter 9. I quote, "For the soul, according to its essence, cannot reach the purely non-existent, but when it descends, it comes into evil, and insofar into non-existence. If, on the other hand, it runs in the opposite direction, it does not arrive at another, but at itself, and thus, since it is not in another, it cannot be in nothing, but only in itself. And only in itself and not in that as something existing, one becomes oneself insofar as one deals with that, no longer being but over-being. If someone sees himself in this state, then he has in himself a likeness of that, and if he passes from himself as an image to the archetype, then he is at the goal of the journey. And if he falls out of sight, he reawakens the virtue in himself. And if he then perceives that his self is permeated by the virtues of order and form, he will again become light, and through virtue will ascend to intellect and wisdom, and through wisdom to that is the one." This is the life of the gods and divine blissful mean, seclusion from everything else that is here, a life that does not desire the earthly escape of the only one to the only one. This is the phyge mono pros monon. I translated a flight of the lone to the lone. Here Armstrong's translation is escape of the only one to the only one. End of quotation. Plotinus, as I already mentioned, was not only a philosophical teacher, but at the same time a spiritual guide for his students. A similar relationship apparently existed between the Neoplatonist Proclus and his teacher Syrianus. Proclus referred to him as his soul guide, his hegemon. Syrianus was for him the guide to all that is good and beautiful, he says in the Platonic theology. The archetype of a spiritual guide is, according to late Neoplatonism, the semi-mythological figure of the pre-Socratic philosopher Pythagoras. He is described as the originator of an art of living based on music, vegetarianism, and different techniques of ascetic self-limitation. A wonderful passage is that written by Iamblichus, the disciple of Porphyry, in the Vita Pythagorae 16. I quote, "Music therefore performed this Pythagorean adjustment, but another kind of purification of the discursive reason and also of the whole soul through various studies was effected by asceticism. He had a general notion that disciplines and studies should imply some form of labor, and therefore, like a legislator, he decreed trials of the most varied nature. punishments and restraints by fire and sword, for innate intemperance and an ineradicable desire for possession, which he, depraved, could neither suffer nor sustain. Moreover, his intimates were ordered to abstain from all animal food, and like other that are hostile to the reasoning power by impeding its genuine energies. On them he likewise enjoined suppression of speech and perfect silence, exercising them for years at a time in the subjugation of the tongue, while strenuously and assiduously investigating and ruminating over the most difficult theorems. Hence also he ordered them to abstain from wine, to be sparing in their food, thus to sleep little, and to cultivate an unstudied contempt of and hostility to fame, wealth, and the like, unfeignedly to reverence those to whom reverence is due, genuinely to exercise democratic assimilation and heartiness towards their fellows in age, and towards their juniors, courtesy, encouragement without envy. End of quotation. This is an impressive list for the Platonic art of living, but it is projected back to Pythagoreanism. So it's a historical projection, of course. Another aspect of an art of living within Neoplatonism is the so-called theurgy. Theurgy is a bundle of sacred practices in late Neoplatonism, theoretically formulated and defended by Iamblichus and by Proclus, which can also be understood as a version of spiritual exercises. By theurgy, one understands trans-rational cults and rites by which the practitioners can get into touch with the gods. So it's a magical strategy to get into contact with divine reality. The basic idea is formulated by Iamblichus as follows in the writing De Mysteriis. I quote, "It is not thinking that unites the theurgists with the gods, for what else should prevent the theoretically philosophers to reach the theurgic unification with the gods? But this is not the case. It is the God-appropriate consummation of the ineffable and above all thinking acts, the power of the mute symbols which are comprehended only by the gods, by which the theurgic unification is achieved. Therefore, they do not work through our thinking, for then their power would be spiritual and depend on us. But neither of these is true, for without our thinking, the signs themselves work their own work by their own power, and the ineffable power of the gods to which those are directed recognizes them themselves by themselves as their images without being awakened by our thinking." In the quotation, we find a clear non-rational strategy of self-transformation. Late Neoplatonism turned away from the purely rationalistic approach defended by Plato and also by Plotinus, who rejected these methods, these rites and symbols and so on. And the later Neoplatonists then left room for a non-cognitive way of self-divinization or self-transformation. Third section, Platonism and Christianity. The interactions between Christianity and ancient philosophy cannot be summarized into either a conflict thesis or a harmony thesis. This begins with the observation that the New Testament itself contrary to a superficial impression, does not contain a rejection of philosophy. The Pauline texts that seem to exhibit an anti-philosophical tendency, namely Colossians 2:8 and the 1 Corinthians 1:17 following and 3:19, by no means reject philosophy as a whole, but oppose individual doctrines. Also, it would be a misunderstanding if one wanted to apply the famous saying from the Sermon on the Mount, "Do not worry about your soul" in Matthew 6, as a rejection of a philosophical self-care. What is meant here is only the care for everyday goods, and only an anxious and self-centered accumulation of goods is rejected. Conversely, it would be just as exaggerated to see in Jesus's call to watchfulness and to be ready in Mark 13 and elsewhere, a close parallel to the philosophical training of spiritual attention. In the New Testament context, the end time near expectation forms the background for such an exhortation to watchfulness. The New Testament proves to be neutral towards the philosophical model of the art of living. Thus, for a Christian, approval and rejection of ancient philosophy were equally possible. In fact, both tendencies are found to a considerable extent. While Greek church fathers tended to take a positive view of philosophy, the rejection of a worldly or a pagan wisdom with a reference to Paul prevailed in the Latin West, at least until the 4th century. 4th century. The positive attitude with which many Greek apologists accepted the conceptual and argumentative means of philosophy since the second half of the 2nd century AD resulted, on the one hand, from prestige reasons. Abandoning the conceptual resources of philosophy would have given Christianity the character of a vulgar sect. The ridicule of the educated pagan public is in any case palpable in the anti-Christian treatises of Celsus and of Porphyry. Christian authors therefore operated with the moments of appreciation, instrumentalization, overbiting, and repudiation of pagan philosophy. But this is largely based on its irrational means. Also, the very fact that ancient philosophy had a practical character seems to have formed a bridge to the self-understanding of Christianity. The fact that religion's wisdom and salvation teachings could claim the term philosophy for themselves, moreover, is a phenomenon that is older than Christianity. It can already be proven in Hellenistic Judaism and in Gnosticism. Philo of Alexandria, in particular, offered an impressive synthesis of religious revelation and philosophy. He acted thus as an important model for Christian authors with his combination of arguments from the Holy Scripture and reason, and with his use of Platonic and Stoic terms to interpret the Bible. The conscious adaptation of philosophy by Christian apologists begins with Justin Martyr, who was a philosopher before his conversion and retained the self-designation even as a Christian. He went as far as to characterize Christianity fundamentally as philosophy, using an expression from the Platonic tradition as true philosophy, which is in Latin vera philosophia. Justin thus expressed the conviction that pagan philosophy is completed in Christianity, because Christians, I quote, live with the logos, i.e. with Christ, meta logu biuntes. They are, according to Justin, the true philosophers. In particular, Clement of Alexandria, in his Traumates, further elaborated the thesis of Christianity as the true philosophy. Clement speaks of a service to men, peritus anthropus therapeia, with the goal of moral improvement, insight, and salvation. In Traumates 2:20, we find the following passage, I quote, "We must then exercise ourselves in taking care about those things which fall under the power of the passions, fleeing like those who are truly philosophers, such articles of food as excite lust and dissolute, licentiousness, enchambering and luxury, and the sensations that tend to luxury, which are a solid reward to others, must no longer be so to us. For God's greatest gift is self-restraint, for he himself said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, as having judged thee worthy according to the true election. Thus then, while we attempt piously to advance, we shall have put on us the mild yoke of the Lord from faith to faith, one charioteer driving each of us onward to salvation, that the meet fruit of beatitude may be won. Exercise is, according to Hippocrates, of course, not only the health of the body, but of the soul, fearlessness of labors, a ravenous appetite for food." End of quotation. Clement, the Christian church father, remarkably quotes here the pagan physician Hippocrates to corroborate the parallel between the health of the body and that of the soul provided by philosophy. Besides Clement, the central representative of a Christian philosophy, which was at the same time conceived in a practical and ascetic way, is in the Greek East Origen. The art of living aspect of Origen's understanding of philosophy is tangible, among other things, in the news that Origen practiced a philosophical life to the highest degree, partly by fasting exercises, partly by limiting the length of his sleep. Moreover, the value of ancient education for the life of a Christian was defended by Basil of Caesarea in his writing Pros Neus. Moreover, he significantly influenced Eastern monasticism with his ascetica. The Platonic motive of a homoiousis theo, as we already saw, the assimilation to God, had a significant effect in the philosophical mysticism of early church fathers. Moreover, Christianity retained from Epicureanism the parrhesiastic tradition, the concept and practice of asceticism, and likewise the figure of the wise master. Look at the collection of sayings of the Desert Fathers, which are called Apophthegmata Patrum. In the Latin West, Ambrose, Marius Victorinus, and Augustine in particular drew positively on philosophy. Augustine translated philosophy in the wake of Cicero's Studium Sapientiae, or as Amor Sapientiae, and in addition to Christianity, also certified Platonism to be more than just a wisdom of the world. An admirable text which describes the life of a holy virgin, Macrina, the sister of Gregory of Nyssa and Basil, is based on the idea that Christian asceticism is essentially philosophy. It's taken from Gregory of Nyssa, I quote, and such was the order of their life, such was the high level of philosophy and the holy conduct of their living by day and by night, that it exceeds the power of words to describe it. For just as souls are freed from their bodies by death, and at the same time liberated from the cares of this life, so was their existence separated from these things, removed from all of life's vanity, and fashioned in harmonious imitation of the life of angels. In them no anger, envy, hate, arrogance, nor any other such thing was seen. The desire for foolish things of no substance, for honor, glory, delusions of grandeur, the need to be superior to others, and all such things had to be eradicated. Self-control was their pleasure, not to be known as was their fame. Their wealth was in possessing nothing and in shaking off all material surplus, like dust from the body. Their work was none of the concerns of this life, except insofar as it was a subordinate task. Their only care was for divine realities, and there was a constant prayer and the unceasing singing of hymns, extended equally throughout the entire day and night, so that this was both work and respite from work for them. End of quotation. We find this quotation, as well as many similar ones, we find here a Christianized or baptized form of the ancient philosophical art of living. Finally, my chapter 4, The Art of Living in Augustine. Let us finally have a look at the most important of all church fathers, namely Augustine. He has a characteristic and highly influential attitude towards philosophy as an art of living. In the course of the 4th century, a disdain for the practical achievements of philosophy seems to have arisen among Christian authors, before even Justin Martyr, as we saw, conceded that non-Christians such as Heraclitus or Socrates had led a life according to the Logos. In contrast, as Julius Domansky has shown, in John Chrysostom, we find a very unfavorable judgment of the ethical practice of the pagans, including polemics against Socrates or against the cynic Diogenes. Chrysostom estimated the ethical practice of the philosophers as inferior and insignificant compared to that of Christians. In this way, he subsequently favored a judgment that limited the value of philosophy to the realm of the theoretical and reserved ethical and religious practice entirely for Christianity. A similar devaluation of the philosophical form of life as in Chrysostom is found in the late Augustine. Augustine also asserts the inadequacy of the ancient conception of virtue for the attainment of happiness and the moral failure of philosophers. The virtues of the philosophers, he argues, had no foundation in God, were therefore imperfect, and even more likely to be classified as vices. Vitia potius quam virtutes, he says in the City of God 19. This Augustinian judgment is not a blanket devaluation. It only means that the ancient practice of virtue acquires a complete meaning only against the background of the Christian conception of grace. The Church Father himself, with his intention to prove Christianity as a theoretical as well as a practical perfection of philosophy, remains decisively determined by the ancient model of self-care. Philosophy is also for Augustine a spiritual exercise and exercitatio animi. However, through the negative judgments in Chrysostom and Augustine, the tendency is preparing to ignore the art of living model in favor of an exclusively religious practice of piety, which then, according to Julius Dolmansky, fully happened in the 13th century, where philosophy and spiritual practice were separated from that on, roughly from the times of Thomas Aquinas. The close interconnectedness of argumentative practice in philosophy and personal transformation becomes evident if we compare two interesting passages of Augustine's Confessions. On the one hand, Augustine describes the Milan ascent in Book 7 as inspired by the reading of Neoplatonic writings, Platonicum Libri. On the other hand, the mystical experience shared with his mother Monica in Ostia shortly before her death is told in Book 9 of the Confessions. During the first period, he was still a pagan, while at the time of the second experience, he had converted to Christianity. Is there a characteristic difference between the two mystical experiences and their descriptions? In Confessions 7, he tells us, I quote, "For examining whence it was that I admired the beauty of bodies, celestial or terrestrial, and what aided me in judging soundly on things mutable and pronouncing this ought to be thus, this not. Examining, I say, whence it was that I so judged, seeing I did so judge, I had found the unchangeable and true eternity of truth above my changeable mind, and thus, by degrees, I passed from bodies to the soul, which through the bodily senses perceives, and thence to its inward faculty, to which the bodily senses represent things external, whither to reach the faculties of beasts, and thence again to the reasoning faculty, to which what is received from the senses of the body is referred to be judged, which finding itself also to be in me a thing variable, raised itself up to its own understanding and drew away my thoughts from the power of habit, withdrawing itself from those troops of contradictory phantasms, that so it might find what that light was whereby it was bedewed, when without all doubting it cried out that the unchangeable was to be preferred to the changeable, whence also it knew that unchangeable, which, unless it had in some way known, it had had no sure ground to prefer it to the changeable. And thus, with the flash of one trampling glance, it arrived at that which is, and then I saw thy invisible things understood by the things which are made. But I could not fix my gaze thereon, and my infirmity being struck back, I was thrown again on my wonted habits, carrying along with me only a loving memory thereof, and a longing for what I had, as it were, perceived the odor of, and was not yet able to feed on." End of quotation. Augustine describes here a systematic approach to the intelligible reality, completely in the spirit of Neoplatonism. He starts his ascent from the faculty to judge, and he wonders, oh, what is the faculty to judge, and comes to an inward faculty, to an interiorem vim, and then proceeds to the reasoner faculty ad ratiocinantem potentiam, by methodically withdrawing his attention from the contradictory phantasms, he finally arrived at that which is, at id quod est. And now compare what we just saw with Confessions Book 9. I also quote that. And when our discourse was brought to that point, that the very highest delight on the earthly senses, in the very purest material light, was in respect of the sweetness of that life, not only not worthy of comparison, but not even of mention, we raising up ourselves with a more glowing affection towards the self-same, did by degrees pass through all things bodily, even the very heaven, whence sun and moon and stars shine upon the earth. Yea, we were soaring higher yet by inward musing and discourse and admiring of thy works, and we came to our own minds and went beyond them, that we might arrive at the region of never-failing plenty, where thou feedest Israel forever with the food of truth, and where life is the wisdom by whom all these things are made, and what have been and what shall be, and she is not made but is, as she has been, and so shall be ever, yea, rather, to have been and hereafter to be are not in her, but only to be, seeing she is eternal. For to have been and to be hereafter are not eternal. And while we were discoursing and panting after her, we slightly touched on her with the whole effort of our heart. End of quotation. The vision of Ostia, this so-called vision of Ostia, this text here, is again a systematic and methodic ascent towards God. Here Augustine emphasizes that the process of raising ourselves towards the self-same must be done by passing in degrees through all things bodily, erigentes nos in id ipsum, in order to arrive at the infallible truth of the divine intellect. As the comparison clearly shows, Augustine preserves the philosophical tradition of self-management and self-transformation from Neoplatonism, even with regard to the highest point of his theology, the cognition of God. Thank you for your attention.
Oh, thanks. Vielen Dank für den schönen Vortrag. I actually have learned a lot for this inspiring talk. Now maybe it's our Q&A time. As a moderator, I would like to ask some questions or make some comments. This is a very historical and philosophical presentation on art of living, and Professor Hun has showed the sources on art of living on the one hand in the ancient philosophy and also in the Christianity. And most important is Professor Horn tries to harmonize the Christianity and ancient philosophy regarding the art of living, and some very important issues there are the self-care, the self-knowledge, and the rational approach toward the self, and so on. And regarding my questions, maybe I have 2 to 3 questions or remarks. The first is about the relationship between the theurgy. It's hard to pronounce it. The theurgy in the Neoplatonism and the intellectual approach. I'm not sure whether the Christian liturgy has also could be traced back to the theology in New Platonism. But I think there may be some also association between sign or as the signal in the philosophy of language and the liturgy, and through the author signs we can convert ourselves to the highest vision, highest essence. So I'm not sure whether this is a approach to harmonize the theology and intellectual approach inside the new Platonism. This is the first question. The second one, maybe this is a very general question regarding the understanding of Plotinus, because Professor Hun has a very rationalistic approach in understanding Plotinus, but there is also other opinion or more traditional approach towards Plotinus regarding Plotinus as the first philosopher of the mysticism. Maybe this is also my question. And regarding the understanding of philosophy by Augustine, as far as I am concerned, maybe Augustine has two attitudes toward philosophy. The first one is negative. In his previous stage, he argues that I have already conversed to philosophy in the influence of Cicero. But in the later time, he criticized himself. Oh, the philosophy is only the wisdom of this world. But however, he has sometimes he has also criticized philosophy in general, and also he has criticized New Platonism in De Civitate Dei in the book 2022 regarding the eschatology, especially the side the blessed life or the Vita Beata is not merely a sight of the soul, rather sight of body and soul. So in this passage, it seems that Augustine has a little bit different from the New Platonism. And the last point is that in this talk, we have seen the rational approach towards art of living, but maybe by Augustine, he has not only a rational approach, but also a voluntary or voluntary or willingly approach toward philosophy. That means it is not enough to rationalize or philosophize with intellect. It is also important to allude to will or grace. Maybe I'm not sure whether there is also some method to harmonize these two traditions. Yeah, that's all my questions. Thanks.
Thank you for these wonderful questions, which are at the same time challenges. So this is very valuable what you are asking. The first point concerning theology, of course, there is a strong parallel between Christian liturgy and Neoplatonic theology. That is right, and several scholars have observed that. Some even saying that Neoplatonic theology is a reaction to Christianity, since then you had on the one hand the holy, sacred things, procedures of the Christians, whereas the pagan philosophers had nothing similar to offer, and so one could come to the idea that the pagans created something similar to a Christian liturgy to have an adequate equivalent for the Christian liturgy. I don't think so. I think it is exaggerated, since the basic spirit of the way in which the late Neoplatonists, starting with Iamblichus, did these things, these formulas, holy formulas, having signs, using symbols, doing rites, and so on. The spirit of this was magical. So it was rather magical. Look, it was rather in the sense of what is called the corpus hermeticum, or what is later in medieval Western times and early modern times called alchemy. Yeah? So it's rather a magical practice in the style of the later medieval Neoplatonist Marsilio Ficino. So he was a Catholic priest, but at the same time he did theurgy in the sense of practicing magic. So it makes spirits appear and so on. So it is really a trans-rational practice, and not only a service to God. So it's not only worshipping God, but it makes the gods appear. Yeah? You see the spirit of theurgy. Okay, concerning your second point, Plotinus's mysticism. Yes, of course, I do not reject the idea that Plotinus defended mysticism. Of course, he is a mystic and he defended mysticism, but he thought that mysticism is simply about using arguments, using theory, using concepts. So he was not convinced that one could liberate one's soul from the earthly conditions by doing rites and practices and doing sacrifices and so on. And there is this famous anecdote that someone asked him, why don't you go to the temple to worship the gods? And he said, the gods have to come to me. The gods have to come to me, by which he meant it's not about doing conventional things. It's not about simply practicing external formulas and so on, but it is about preparing one's soul by intellectual means to a mystical ascent. Your third question concerning Augustine's first conversion inspired by Cicero's Hortensius. Yeah, that's right. There was this first impressive reading by the young rhetoric Augustine, who was impressed. He was really impressed by Cicero's Hortensius and appreciated philosophy, but this was not really a conversion, since then he became a rhetoric. His real conversion was by these Platonicorum libri, translated by Marius Victorinus, which are writings of Porphyry and of Plotinus. So he was deeply influenced, as is shown by the books 8 to 10 of the City of God. He was deeply influenced by these writings, these Platonicorum libri, and his elements of anti-Platonism, which are, this is correct, there is anti-Platonism also in Augustine, concerning first, as you said, the bodily resurrection in book 22 of the City of God, but many other aspects are partly anti-Platonists, anti-Platonist. These elements are due to his interest in being an Orthodox Christian. Yeah? So he wanted to be an Orthodox Christian and then turned partly away from Platonism, but the basic structure remained the Platonic one. And your final fourth question concerning voluntarism, of course, we cannot achieve our happiness by ourselves. He clearly says so. So it's clear that we would not be successful without divine without divine support, which he calls grace. So grace is absolutely necessary for someone's happiness and someone's redemption. That's absolutely clear, and that's a non-Platonic element. That's right. But I would call it voluntaristic in the sense related to the human agent. It's voluntaristic concerning the divine intervention. So it's not the case that we can decide if or if not we want to turn to God. In this sense, it is not voluntaristic, but there is a voluntaristic element in the divine grace or the absence of grace. Thank you so much.
Maybe a following question regarding the last one. As far as I know, that in Plotinus, the Platonists has also used the concept shahis as also as a grace. I'm not sure whether it is whether there's some what is the difference between katia and charis.
So charis is the Greek equivalent, the standard equivalent of Latin gratia in several respects. It does not only mean grace in the sense of divine grace, but also being charming. So a graceful person looks charming or something. So it is still present in English today. So charis and gratia mean both looking attractive and then the grace, for instance, of the emperor. So the emperor could kill you and you say, oh, please don't kill me. And the emperor says, okay, you have my grace. So these two notions, and in this respect, charis and gratia have the same semantic reach. And there is this concept in Plotinus, but it's not constitutive for someone's ascent towards the higher reality. So it's not necessary to have divine grace, but it is necessary and sufficient to do rational exercise. So if you do in an argumentative style Plato reading and Aristotle reading, also the Stoics are also valuable. And if you train your arguments, then you will liberate your soul, according to Plotinus.
Oh, vielen Dank. Thanks. And there is a doctor from Tübingen Universität, Dr. Xu, would like to raise his questions. So welcome, Yifei Xiong.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Professor. And I have a question about Plotinus, and this question has a similarity with Professor He, and I want to ask you how to explain the theory of apele panta. I think you are mentioned any other book 5.6 4.3 as the ending of this chapter, and I think Plotinus' point is more stronger. He want to improve that we must leave behind all things, including ourselves or including our pure intellect. But according to Platonism, the point is the excesses is concentrating on ourselves or a conversion to ourselves. I think they have a conflicts between each other as well. On the one hand, we must leave behind all things, including ourselves. But in the other hand, we must concentrate or paying attention to the true ourselves. I want to know how would you explain the complex? And then another question is about how could we understand the negative theology in Platonism, in Plotinus, I think. Maybe it is also a challenge to the theory of Platonism. Yeah, this is my
thank you. Thank you for these important points. You are mentioning the Plotinian writing 5.3, which is 49, the treatise 49 in the chronological order, and this treatise is about self-knowledge, and what here is defended is first the point that against Sextus Empiricus we can have real self-knowledge. Sextus Empiricus claimed that self-knowledge is a contradictory idea, so a self-defeating idea. We cannot have self-knowledge. And Plotinus defends that for the so-called intellect, for the nous. He defends the idea that we can have real self-knowledge on the basis of the identity of the knowing subject and the knowing object. And this might be meant by the expression afhelle panta, which is at the end of this treatise. So afhelle comes from afheirein, afheirestai, and afheiresis is the equivalent for the Latin and the English word abstractio, abstraction. Yeah? So afheiresis and abstraction are parallel. And then there is a second step, which is not afheiresis, but apophasis. And apophasis is negation. So one should distinguish between abstraction and negation. And abstraction means that we should leave earthly conditions behind and focus on the intellectual nature of ourselves. And then we gain self-knowledge, and we are happy to some degree, and we have full insight and so on. But on the other hand, we can then transcend even this level and unify ourselves with the absolute one. And in order to do that, we should negate everything by a systematic apophatic theology, by a negative theology, which leaves even behind the predication of the time S is P, of the type S is P, so subject is predicate. Yeah, S is P is then left behind, and we are grasping the absolute transcendent one only if we left behind ourselves, and ourselves means the intellect. Yeah? You are right, and I can only support what you are saying. So it's correct what you are asking. Yeah?
Okay, thanks, Professor.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Yifei. And let's welcome Jimmy Chen. He would ask 2 questions.
Hello, Professor Han.
Great to see you. Yeah.
Great to see you again. Always learning a lot from you. I have 2 simple questions. One is following Plotinus' Ennead 5, I believe 5.8. That's concerning the intellect, and you know that news. I believe that 5.8 there is the mention of love. Love as a way of contemplating your true self, to the mimicking the image, your self-image to the internet, and by that way you get closer to the one. And that's I think he used the word love there. In that sense, how would you see, say, for example, Augustine, the Christian theologian? I think he also mentioned a couple of times in his works the love of God is the ultimate good. And you know, I see some parallel in Plotinus' approach, using you know, describing this process of essence as the love of intellectual God. So I'm curious about your thoughts on this parallel of using love as the essence. And the other question is about your last point, one of your last point in the presentation about the immutability of God. I'm thinking, you think it's very simple to, or how Augustine might resolve God is immutable, but in the same time, when Logos come to earth as Jesus Christ, as the Christian thought goes, how we thought of this Logos as a immutable, but at the same time, there is the mutability, seems to be some mutability when he suffered on earth and on the cross, and this suffer in terms of even passions, like experiencing passion. How or what is Augustine's strategy to resolve the immutability of of God versus the Logos that's incarnate and you know, experiences suffering? Yeah, two questions. I would really appreciate insight. Does that make sense? That's all.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you, Jimmy, for these two questions. Concerning Plotinus, there is a treatise, not only in, it is to be found not only in 5.8, it's also elsewhere. And there's an entire treatise, Peritu Erotos, on love in Plotinus. And commentators are yet not arrived at a definitive view, but my view, which is not a very well reflected, but a to some extent it's a qualified view. But what I would like to say is that this treatise on love in Plotinus should not be seen as an equivalent of the concept of agape in Christianity. So it's not agape, it's about eros. And what he wants to say, I think, is he wants to spell out that there is not only dialectical ascent, but also this Platonic ascent by love. You see the point? So he's a Platonist, and he has to do justice to dialogues such as the Lysis or the Symposium. Mm-hmm. And in the Symposium, it's about physical love, it's about erotic love, it's about love between an older man and a younger man, or between males and females, and creating offspring and so on. So that a Platonist thinker has to do justice to that. And in this sense, love has a room in Plotinus, but not in the sense of the Christian agape, the charity, yeah, not in the caritas charity sense. So that's a specific feature of Christianity. So this love thy neighbor element, love God element. And the second question is a bit similar. I think the idea of a kenosis, namely that the incarnated Logos reduced himself from all his outstanding, excellent, brilliant, perfect features of perfection, and he is now characterized by finitude, vulnerability, by passions, is a characteristic Christian thought. And Augustine points that out. He says, oh yeah, Holy Trinity has been described by Porphyry and by Plotinus, but they never arrived at incarnation, which presupposes humility. And this sort of Christian humility is not present in the thoughts of Neoplatonists for Augustine. So all these elements you are mentioning, suffering, having passions, having emotions, death, and so on. But by the way, drinking wine. So Jesus is drinking wine. So, okay, also Plato recommends wine, and he's eating meat. But Plotinus and Porphyry never drank wine and never ate meat. Yeah? They were Pythagorean vegetarians. So this is a difference in style. Jesus is a humble, is the Son of God without showing the divine attributes.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. There are still two questions. One question is in the chatting box, and another will be raised by Dr. Zhong. I will read the question aloud. And Justin Martyr and Augustine were both philosophers before their conversion to Christianity. The question is, what was it that contributed their conversion? What were the Christian elements or Christian way of life or art of living that seems more attractive to them, if any?
I feel not in a position to judge that in detail on Justin. I cannot say this might be a psychological thing. Christianity being a very attractive, connecting social phenomenon. Maybe it was in Justin that, but in Augustine we know in detail how he proceeded from his reading of Cicero's Hortensius. Then he was part of the Manichaean religion. He was for a short period of time a skeptic, and then he came into contact with the Neoplatonic writings, and then he turned to Christianity. And he describes the last step between Neoplatonism and Christianity as an eye-opening event, namely reaching the divine reality, whereas on the basis of the Platonist's writings, as we saw in the quotation, he only believes to have come close to that level. So he describes it as a divine grace to have made this ultimate step from the inside into the immaterial reality of God to the grasp of the divine reality by immediate contact. So having an immediate contact with God, which is a phenomenon done by grace. So he describes that as grace.
Okay, thanks. The last question is from Dr. Zhong.
Thank you, Professor Huang, for your excellent talks. And my question is something like this: as you remarked that the art of living in Plato or by Socrates has two characters. That's the second one, that they don't accept or recognize a non-cognitive spiritual exercise in this art of living. And it seems to me the why Plato or Socrates, he don't accept this non-cognitive spiritual exercise would maybe that Plato or Socrates would think that the reason, mere the reason, have a great motivational force in human, and the knowledge would be a most powerful ruling principles in humans other than any other things. And then when you remark that in late Platonism, they accept or recognize some non-cognitive practice in this art of living. So my question is something like, why these thinkers would in this time to accept something non-cognitive spiritual exercise? Are they have a different opinion or different standpoints about reason and about knowledge as Plato or Socrates have?
I think it depends on the anthropology and the psychology of a philosopher. So if you are thinking that human beings are unitary and that only one element in us counts, namely rationality. So we are rational souls embedded, incarnated, incorporated into a body, but the body does not count and the lower parts of the soul do not count. If you think like that, then you will think that it is only about a spiritual or intellectual exercise that you can do the way to happiness. But if you are thinking that human beings are complex entities composed of several psychological factors, parts of the soul, you have a